Thanks, Allie, and thank you to those of you who are out on Zoom. It's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker, our last speaker for the Fake News Symposium this year, Professor and STEM librarian Dan Chibnall from Drake. Professor Chibnall is an academic librarian specializing in embedded librarianship, information literacy skills, science communication, and helping students become better researchers. He worked closely with STEM faculty and students at Drake, while also teaching courses entitled, get this, these sounds like fun courses, Science Fiction, Science Fact, Communicating Science, Fake News, Filters and Falsehoods, and Science and Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chibnall.
Thank you all. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Marshalltown Community College for having me at the symposium. Thanks to PJ and Sally. Appreciate the warm welcome. I wish I could have met George and Tom. Sound like really amazing guys. So what are we going to talk about this morning? Well, as my introduction noted, I'm a science librarian, STEM librarian. So a lot of the work that I do as a librarian overlaps. So I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. So this morning's presentation is going to look at various things. It's going to look at media literacy. It's going to look at how we communicate, how we consume and analyze information, how we don't do that, how our technology affects us, and how science can provide us with some solutions and awareness for solving these problems in both the short and long term. So let's get to it. Who am I? Well, as you heard from my introduction, I do a lot of different work, and I really enjoy talking about science in all of its various forms, including with my good friend Griff, who is our live mascot at Drake. So I always love to make sure everybody knows that Griff exists. He's a great dog. But I love to teach students and talk to faculty and talk to folks like you about where we are in human culture with our technology. So that's what we're going to dig into this morning. So we're going to explore different things related to what I call information behaviors and information ecosystems. We all know that there are biological ecosystems. There are also information ecosystems. Information doesn't just come out of nowhere. It has to be created. It gets disseminated. It gets shared. And we all now have that power to share things. And that's a great responsibility that we need to be aware of at all times. We're also going to distinguish between types of misinformation and what are called media literacies. And then I'm also going to spend some time talking about some things called cognitive biases, mental shortcuts, stereotypes. These are what I often refer to as the invisible operations of our minds. And so we will get into that quite a bit. So I hope you enjoy a little bit of science this morning. So we do have what we call information overload, or what I sometimes call filter failure, because we have so much information. We have to be concerned about our attention and our focus, especially as it relates to the part of the brain known as executive control. Executive control basically tells us what we should be paying attention to. Why do we care about executive control? Because it also plays a role in forming memories. If we are distracted, if we are not paying attention, if we're not actually thinking about something, that affects not only our ability to analyze, but it also affects our ability to create long-term memory. And so what you think is real today, you might find out later is not real. So our technology has now accelerated us past our old behaviors about information consumption and analysis. And I'm going to get into that today, talking about a concept called cognitive offloading, which this image is sort of trying to represent. It's an idea that scholars have been studying for the past couple of decades. What it basically says is that now that we know we have technology around us at all times, we don't have to remember as much. And so what we do is we offload our cognitive thinking to our devices. And so we're doing less thinking and more recognizing and attempts at remembering. And that can have a really big impact on the way our minds operate. So let's talk about history for a few minutes. So how did people get information 50 years ago? Well, television, radio, newspapers, we still use these things, of course. But what do they all have in common? Well, one big thing, they're all one-way routes of information. You can't talk back to your TV. You can try, but they're not going to listen. You can't talk back to the radio. You can write a letter to the editor, but they may not publish it in the newspaper. So somebody else chose that content for you and you tuned into it and you didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. It's a one-way street. Everything has already been filtered. So you're looking at the final product. And why does that matter? Well, because you basically only have certain choices. And so your everyday thinking, your memories, what you take in, what you consume, has been chosen for you by someone else. And you don't have a lot of choice in the matter. What's the biggest difference today? Well, it's a two-way street. So we now have this issue of attention and focus, executive control. You have more choice. You have faster speeds. You can interact with anyone or anything pretty much anytime you want to. You're constantly connected. You are connected to more information than any other humans in the history of our species. There are more answers, quote unquote. Sounds great, right? The big drawback is that the speed at which this information travels to you as a consumer affects the way that you think, and it affects the way that you demand more of it. So your expectations change. So the technology, not just the information, is changing the way your minds operate. But the thing is, you're not always aware of it. We just swim in this water. We're not even aware that there's water around us. This technology is basically invisible. So what are we talking about here? Let's get deeper. We're all used to using apps, right? Apps contribute to this problem called filter failure. If we're trying to filter our information, the apps do it for us, right? They use algorithms. Social media basically fractures how we get our attention. So it helps us to create a new world. I'll refer to this as a social reality from here on out. So you'll hear me say this phrase fairly often. Social media basically creates social realities around us. We all have them, but we can't always tell you what they are, but we live in them. So because we use technology that allows us to operate at these kinds of speeds, we expect our information to come to us faster and faster. We want it sooner. And if we don't get it, we're going to go somewhere else for it because we don't want to think as much. We just want to sort of see something that makes us feel comfortable. So these algorithms, they basically are doing all kinds of invisible operations behind the scenes that we're not always aware of. And so part of what I'm talking about today is how can we become more aware of the invisible things that are affecting us in our technology and in the way that we think. Because if we're not thinking, if all we're doing is recognizing things and passing things along, then we're not flexing any of the muscles, quote unquote, in our brain, right? We're just passing along information. And we don't want to do that. We want to actually think and analyze and critique and grow the way we think. So some of my slides, they're not necessarily intended to be read in full, but I'd like to give you an idea of how complex this problem is. We often refer to fake news in the United States as a binary issue. In other words, it's A or B. We tend to think a lot like this as Americans. Things are choice A or choice B. Fake news is one symptom of a much larger and deeper problem within Western society. And this is what is known as a mis- and disinformation matrix or spectrum, if you will. The idea is that you see on the left things like satire or parody. So this would be like a late night show host, telling you something that's a little bit off, or, it's funny, but it's not necessarily entirely true. No real harm done. Somebody's feelings get hurt, but there's no problem there. Whereas over on the right, you have things called fabricated content. There's an intent here. This is disinformation. This is propaganda. This is a real problem because someone has a motive to give you certain information that they want you to act on in a certain way. And then you have everything in between. So when we use the term fake news, it is much more than just somebody having a good time or somebody just trying to trick you. There's a lot happening in that in between. So I think it's important that we remember that. If we try to oversimplify any of this, then we're going to fall prey to bad information in the long run. We have to think about these things in complex ways. I like to show my students this image because it's an example of what we're doing pretty much with our information all the time. This is an example of filtering. You can set up filtering in your daily, weekly, monthly, yearly habits of how you take in information. And when you do that, you can basically grow nice things like that flower. But when you're filtering, you're also excluding what's on the left and what's on the right. And I'm just using those as directions, not as political connotations. But you're leaving certain things out. And so you have to make conscious decisions about what you are including and what you're excluding. If you're not making those conscious decisions, then you are simply choosing something subconsciously that you feel comfortable with, that fits within your social reality. And when you do that, you are missing out on all kinds of other information. But you don't always know it because you're just comfy because you've got your sources, you've got your information, right? It's convenient. And this is where we fall into a trap. Another way to think of this is food consumption. We tend to think about every meal we eat every day. What are we going to have for breakfast? Are we going to run to McDonald's? Are we going to make a nice bowl of oatmeal? What's it going to be? What's for dinner? What are we eating later this week, right? We tend to try and plan out our meals as much as we can, right? Because we want to try and stay healthy. But we also love to pig out on snacks and enjoy our favorite foods, right? Same thing goes for information. Some information we simply enjoy. I'm a baseball fan. I like to, during baseball season, spend a little time in the evening reading something fun about baseball, right? It doesn't necessarily make me a better person, but I enjoy it, right? But I don't spend every waking hour learning about baseball. I have to also learn things about the community I live in. What's going on with democratic politics, small d, not the party. What's going on at my work, what's going on in my profession, right? You have to make conscious choices about what you're reading, what you're listening to, and what you're watching. Because otherwise, these are the things that create the ideas in your mind, create your opinions, create the way you react to certain information in your environment. So if you're not doing that, then you're simply reacting, you're not thinking. So you have to think about how do you consume information on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. When you are making good decisions, you want to try and have as much variety as possible. And that's what those bubbles on the outside represent. If you are in the middle there, then you are basically in a very comfortable, homogeneous area. Everything around you is pretty much fit to you and your standards, right? Nice, colorful things, but they're all the same color because they represent you and what you like, right? And the things around you are the algorithms that are basically helping keep you comfortable. They're trying to basically keep you within this little echo chamber, right? We need to be aware that this is happening to us often. And when you say, oh, I'm okay, I get enough information every day, I get a variety. How do you know? Because these algorithms are so good that they hide things from you to the point where people online and now in real life live in very different social realities with different vocabularies and different facts. Because this happens, because we're not making conscious choices about where our information is coming from. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to basically us looking for images or symbols rather than doing any sort of textual analysis, right? These are my students sometimes, and they always laugh at this, right? They find the first thing that they agree with, and boom, put that in the paper, right? This is what filter failure leads to, right? What happens is we start to look for things that connect with us, that agree with us, rather than something that disagrees with us, because it's easy and because it's fast. There it is, I can use it, right? Filter failure, access to massive amounts of information and the acceleration of information and that kind of thinking leads to this. It's what we call confirmation bias. Or if you will, Stephen Colbert, from all the way back in 2005, he was very prescient on this. He called it truthiness. Truth that comes from the gut, not books, right? Or the quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes to be true, rather than concepts or facts known to be true. And this is where you have to do personal reflection, right? As a member of a society, as a professional, as a friend, as a neighbor, as a community member, you have to decide and reflect on which one of these are you really doing and how often do you do it? Because we do it so often now that we're not even aware we're doing it. It's happening in the background. I also like to show this one because this is the basic idea of what we do with our social realities. We build up social realities all the time. And these cavemen figured it out long ago. And the one says, what if they acquire so much knowledge, they can selectively choose facts to mold their own individual realities? And the other caveman gets angry and he says, what if you shut your mouth? How often have we seen that kind of a conversation online, in the comments, right? This is what starts to happen. We have more choice, we have more access, we have more speed, and all those things lead us into building newer and newer micro communities and social realities that anger other people because they don't match up with other people's realities, right? We are diverging from one another because we can create these new realities. We're looking for people we're comfortable with. We're looking for the tribe that we're a part of. And then you get to stuff like this, right? We all run into memes like this online. You know, some people have probably seen the guy on the History Channel before who's famous for saying, you know, I'm not saying it's aliens who built the pyramids, but it's aliens, right? You know, it's funny, it makes you laugh. Sure, memes are great for that. But the problem with memes is that they elicit an emotional reaction, and there's no real analysis here. We're just laughing, but we're also recognizing something. There's all kinds of recognition going on in our minds behind the scenes. We're kind of making fun of this guy because it's silly, right? And so you're not doing any analyzing. And what happens now is you start to look for these kinds of symbols, right? It's sort of like if you went into a doctor's office, right? And let's say MSNBC is on the TV. You might have an instantaneous reaction to that. Some of you might say, oh, MSNBC, I'm going to a different doctor. Or some of you might be like, oh, I love MSNBC, and you sit down. Now, you may not even be listening to what's going on. You may not even be watching what's going on, but you've just made a subconscious decision about that doctor's office and about what's on because you have an association with that image, that logo, right? That's a meme, that's a reaction. And we're doing that more and more according to science and social science. We see things, we react to them, and we don't think about them. We simply say, those folks are part of my tribe, or those folks are not. They're in a different social reality. Or if you want, you could read an article on Raman spectroscopy and astrobiology, right? Everybody wants to read this, right? I can print off some copies for you. You'd love to read this, right? Looks exciting, right? Well, of course not, because obviously this is from an academic journal and it's important research. But the problem is that most people can't read this, and that's okay. They don't have the background knowledge for it. That's all right. Somebody is doing this work to advance science and society. That's fine. But we can't just give stuff like this to people and be like, here you go, here's some facts, please change your mind. And they read it and they're like, thanks, friend. I believe something different now, right? Most people don't do that. That's not how it works. So what we have to do is we have to make things like this that are complex easier for people to understand. And we need to make things visible to people so they understand what's really going on with their technology, with their minds, and with society. And so one of the things, if we were to distill it down to where the problem has begun, is with our technology. Now, I'm not advocating that everybody throw your phones away on the way out of this lecture, right? I'm not a Luddite, I love technology. But here's the thing, we are still in the very early ages of this era, right? The World Wide Web has been around since 1991. Those smart devices and the tablets that followed them have been around for only 15 years this August. That is nothing in the grand scheme of things. And yet we are just starting to learn how they affect the way we think and how we use information and how we react to one another. 15 years, that's it. And so many people have these, right? What these are doing is they're unveiling old shortcuts in our minds that we've had since the dawn of time. But now that we are reacting and living in different ways, we're starting to see things totally differently because the technology is basically making it visible. And so for the next part of this presentation, I want you to keep this slide in mind, that science can't provide us with a silver bullet. It can't bring a platter up and say, here are all your solutions, humanity. Do these things and you'll be just fine. The early days of new eras are always messy because we don't always have all the knowledge. But what I advocate is that we use science as a way to become more aware of what's really going on in our minds and with our technology. And I like to use the phrase that science can help us to make the invisible visible. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to see how the world actually operates in 2022 differently than it did in, say, 1952. So what do we know? Well, we're going to get into the brain a little bit here. We know that brains are not wired for accuracy, right? Our brains did not evolve to basically learn how to read, the Wall Street Journal, or to basically stare at a computer screen. Brains are wired to keep us alive. That's a bottom line thing that we have to remember. Our brains are basically trying to keep us alive. That's a crucial thing. So anything that your brain does can often be traced back to that fact. You have to keep that in mind. Your brain is not always looking out for whether or not you're good at being able to tell whether that story that was just on that news channel is true or not. Your brain's doing all kinds of other stuff in the background. So knowledge that we have is not always created just by individuals alone. Knowledge is created by groups and communities, and it's sustained by groups and communities. And we're starting to see that with information online, because ideas that used to fail, like let's say you had a really strange, new, wacky idea back in, say, 1960, and you wanted to tell people about it, what were you going to do? Call the operator? Go down to the public park? Go to the post office and be like, you know what we should do? We should do this. And people are like, who's this guy, right? You lose self-confidence. Your idea falls flat, right? You got nobody to talk to, no way to get it out there. Media is one way. Now you have an idea. What do? You tweet it, you Facebook it, you TikTok it, right? You get to be a guest on a news show. And now all of a sudden you've just found 100, 1,000, 10,000 more people that agree with your idea. Power in numbers. This is how fake news and misinformation goes viral, because other people can find it for the first time in human history. They don't have to go pick up a book. They don't have to go to your house and listen to your spiel. They can just go find you online. And so ideas that used to die out quickly now survive and grow. What else do we know about the brain? The brain creates a social reality, not just by choosing from the physical world like we do and other animals do to rely on or use. I'm going to use wood, I'm going to use metal, those kinds of things. But we also, as humans, we add on to those realities, right? So in that previous slide, this book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, she has a quote here that I'm going to read to you. She says, social reality is an incredible gift. You can simply make stuff up like a meme or a tradition or a law. And if other people treat it as real, it becomes real. Our social world is a buffer we build around the physical world. And the author Linda Berry adds on to that. She says, we don't create a fantasy world to escape reality. We create it to stay. And what that means is, now that we have access to the information that makes us comfortable and that fits our reality, that fits our worldview, we continue to do it. We don't backtrack. We want the reality that we're most comfortable with. And now that we can choose our facts from all these different sources, that becomes easier. And then we can find our other groups and our tribes to connect with. Now that can be fine if it's just a hobby, but if you disagree about something really important, it becomes a bigger problem. Misinformation in politics is not something that can be solved just by having people read different newspapers or watching different TV channels or giving them a lesson in media literacy. If we teach people how to recognize fake news, that's good. That's a step in the right direction. But when you teach people how to recognize and correct for misinformation, all you're really doing is helping them to treat a symptom of a much deeper and larger social problem that's been around for a long time. So what I'm talking about is that these problems run very deep historically, and they overlap with issues related to things like race and gender and religion. So we can't simply, lift the veil from people's eyes and say, hey, look at that. And they're like, cool, I was wrong. Most people don't do that, right? Most people don't like to admit that they're wrong. If we want to fix some of these things, it's going to take years, if not decades, because these social realities are often constructed by things that are outside of our control, things that run very deep. So when we talk about misinformation, it's not like a whole thing up onto itself. It's a symptom of something that is an offshoot of something deep that goes back a long time. Take a look at what's going on right now with Ukraine, right? We're seeing this play out in real time. And if you think it's only happening in Russia or Ukraine, you're wrong. Because everyone in the Western world can now have their own select opinion about what's going on over there based on where they're getting their information from. This is an example of how information can be weaponized. If you look at Russian media and what they're saying about this conflict, it is completely different than what you would read in, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post or watch on Fox News or CNN. Totally different narrative. And people buy it. They eat it up, right? Because they don't do the work to figure out where this is coming from, or they don't ask the questions about what their mind is doing. It just fits a reality that they're comfortable with. And algorithms accelerate this. So this is where the technology comes in again. So something that, you might say, oh, well, that's fake. Sure, of course that's fake. And then you go on Twitter and it's like, here's 10,000 people who just retweeted the fake thing. Good luck backtracking on that, right? Now a whole bunch more people have seen it. It's very hard to roll a snowball back up into the avalanche, right? It just doesn't work. And then we have the pandemic. And when people ask me, Dan, what did you do during the pandemic? And I'm like, well, I taught courses on misinformation and science communication. And they're like, so you were busy? I was like, yeah. I could stay here all day and talk to you about misinformation as it relates to the pandemic. But the situation here is that we have seen examples of all these things with the virus, with masking, with vaccines, right? It is an objective scientific fact supported by data that has been meticulously collected over the past 2 years, that this is a situation where misinformation and disinformation literally can lead to severe death or severe disease and death. These are real world problems. If you believe the wrong thing, you live in the wrong social reality, you could suffer from it health-wise. And so people want the ultimate safe and comfortable existence. People always want that. That's what humans want, right? That's what we want as organisms. And so who are they going to trust? Well, first and foremost, anyone within their social reality, their social community that tells them what to do. They're not always going to listen to somebody that's outside of that community because it disagrees with how they see the world. And so when it comes to health, you start to actually have real negative consequences. We also see the rise of what's called pseudoscience. So these are things that we study in my classes a lot. They resemble science, but they are not science. Now, most of the time, pseudosciences are harmless. They can be hobbies, they can be fun things, they can be little things that make you feel comfortable, right? Like a nice smelling candle for aromatherapy, or having an adjustment done by a chiropractor, right? These are all things that are on a spectrum of science or pseudoscience. But the problem is that we've seen a rise in this during the pandemic. Science moves slowly, right? It does not move lightning fast. And because we now expect all this accelerated, quick information, everyone wants science to basically give them the answer right away. I joke with my students that when the pandemic started, all of a sudden the public is looking over the scientist's shoulder and they're like, hey, what are you working on? What are you working on? Did you fix it yet? Did you get it? Did you get it? When am I going to get that shot? What am I supposed to do? Oh my God, right? So for most of our living days, scientists are up here and we're back here and we're glad they're doing their work. But the pandemic shortened that distance. And now we're in the lab with them being like, hey, can you hurry this up? I'm really tired of being in my house, right? Science doesn't work that way. And so the negative of that is that we have these really high expectations and we search for quick answers. And that's where people use the wrong treatment, they get sick, or they don't do anything at all. And then there's even bigger problems. So where can we go to look for help on this? Well, information science is one place. Information scientists study this kind of thing, and they have been since the rise of social media in the early 2000s, because this is how a lot of fast-moving viral information gets around now. And so they have to understand how information ecosystems work in the 21st century. So by studying how information flows through these ecosystems, especially in still relatively new online environments, we can learn how technology affects the way we look for, consume, create, attack, and defend different types of information. This diagram is a close examination, just one of many, of how people communicated online and shared information leading up to the January 6th insurrection. And so you can see who was communicating with who by different types of politically leaning communities, who the sharers were, where the falsehoods were, where they originated, right? And this can all be done using public data. And so information scientists, this is the kind of thing that they're using to figure out how can we get to the root of this problem? Because the people doing this They're not going to change their mind simply because you retweeted something that was a fact and not what they said. That's not what they're looking for. They're not going to look at their phone and be like, oh, wrong place, and turn around. This is much deeper. And so this is an examination of how we can get to those deeper roots. Let's talk about stereotypes. This plays a huge role in how we fall prey to false information, misinformation, disinformation, simple little silly things, right? Science can help us to understand what those invisible things are, right? So science can help us to navigate these waters of things like confirmation bias, right? We overvalue evidence that supports our beliefs. We do this frequently and way more often than we used to, since we're constantly being bombarded by information sources, right? So how do stereotypes fit into this? We have no mechanism to get rid of them, right? Here's an example from a book by Jessica Nordell called The End of Bias. I want to read this quote to you because I think it's very important that we recognize the negative effect of stereotypes. She writes, if a person assumes a woman is less competent and therefore declines to assign her a challenging assignment, that person receives no feedback about her capacity. If a person assumes Black means dangerous and therefore crosses the street to avoid that person receives no information about whether their assumption was right or wrong. If a doctor stereotypes about women or people of color cause them to take symptoms less seriously and a patient seeks care elsewhere, their stereotype is not contradicted. It may just be employed again and again. This is the problem with biases and stereotypes. They come into play constantly. We're just not always aware of it. And because they often reinforce what we already believe, we continue to do it. And so what science can help us with is to figure out, how do we help people see these things and know the triggers for when they happen so that we don't create them? Because once we create them, they're very hard to get out of our minds. Let's talk about habits and implicit bias. So the cultural knowledge that we absorb from our social realities, some of those things are true facts, right? Given to us by science and by learning. And some are just old stories that won't go away, right? So for example, here's one. Some people still believe that men are better at math than women. We know that this is not true, but it gets embedded into our minds and becomes an implicit bias. So how we react to a situation and how we feel about it happens quickly, and it's rooted in this cultural knowledge. We just don't always know that we're doing it. So our reactions become a habit, a shortcut, all based on some old implicit bias that's been in our minds for years, if not decades, right? This is that anchoring effect happening again. None of this necessarily makes you like a bad person. It just it's a reminder that you live in a culture, that you live in a social reality, and that you often have to reflect and be aware of what you actually know about the world. Who told you? Why do you trust them? Let's talk about stereotypes again, cognitive biases and potential solutions. Here's the thing about stereotypes that sounds kind of weird, but it's true. They're hard to get rid of because they actually serve a function. They persist because they're culturally useful. They allow the brain to understand our environment and make sense of it in an efficient way, right? When you walk into a room and you see a bunch of people, your brain isn't like, okay, let's put our feet up and figure out who's who. And your brain doesn't do that. Your brain starts making all kinds of assumptions about what it sees, right? How old someone is, what race they are they displaying any sort of religious ornamentation? Are they a child? Right? Are they talking too loudly? Do they have a haircut that bothers you, right? Your brain is doing all these things, right? And so they serve a function, or at least they used to. And now they're kind of a problem for us. The brain does all kinds of stuff that it used to do, and it still does them, and it's not always helpful, right? So we have to help people understand how to spot the triggers of stereotypes and cognitive biases, because we can't solve these things on our own. We have to help educate people as to how to get rid of them. So I used to come at this as an information specialist, as a science librarian, and sort of see this as, oh, I can solve this with information. I can just give people new information and everything will be fine. But you can't. This is an interdisciplinary problem. It has to be solved by historians, legal scholars, sociologists, right? The famous Daniel Kahneman had this analogy for how our brains work. He never said that this is exactly how they work, but it's a way for us to help see it, that oftentimes our brains think in what's called system 1 thinking, which is sort of reaction. System 2 is more of the, oh, I'm going to reflect on this and really think about it, right? And there are models to basically do what's called invisible unlearning, to basically help us understand when we're doing system 1 and when we're doing system 2, and to be cognizant of that. And the more you do it, the more you practice, the better you get at it, and the less time you have to actually spend doing it, because you've trained your brain to do it. You've trained your brain to take a new neural pathway. Then we have these, and I'm sure you've all seen one of these at some point on social media or on the news. This is what's called a media bias chart. Now, I'm not entirely against them, but I do call them the siren song of solutions, because people think, oh, if I just find my source on this chart, I'll be okay, right? The problem with media bias charts is that they treat all sources of information equally. And the problem is that we do not just read newspapers, right? We watch TV, we listen to podcasts, we look at YouTube channels, right? We do all kinds of stuff. So if you're going to trust a media bias chart, you really need to find out how are they measuring sources against one another. Some of the sources in this chart in particular, they only took 15 pieces of evidence to make their judgment about it, their calculation. Whereas others, they chose hundreds. Well, that's unequal, right? Or how do you judge the New York Times op-ed page against a podcast that's done by Huffington Post? How do you do that? What we need to do is basically examine what's going on the y-axis here and do things like original analysis. Are they reporting facts? Or are they just reporting opinions? How reliable are they? Here's another one of those slides. I don't intend for you to be able to read this. If you can, I'd love to know what your vision is, because you really need some good eyes to see this. But the point of me showing you this slide is, this is the invisible happening right now in your mind. And these are just the cognitive biases that we know about. I like to joke with my students when we first learn about cognitive biases. I said, okay, who brought their brain manual with you today to class? And they're like, what? I'm like, you know, the manual the doctor gave your parents when you were born about how your brain works. Nobody brought that with them. You were supposed to bring that. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, I'm just joking, because that doesn't exist, right? We live with these things. We live with this 3-pound piece of tissue up here, but nobody ever tells us that all this stuff is happening in the background. It's like those weird programs that run on the background of your computer. You're like, I guess they're doing something, right? This is what we're up against, people. This is where misinformation gets manifested. This is the source, the stuff that's going on behind the scenes of our brains. And if we're going to solve this, we have to help people at younger and younger ages understand what these invisible operations are, because they have all kinds of names: the backfire effect, the illusion of explanatory depth. And the key thing is once we know what they are and we can give them a name, we can get much better at trying to avoid them. What else can we do? We can also lean on science to tell us, from both social sciences and information sciences, again, how social media affects the way we share things, because we all share things, right? So here you have an example. Basically on the left, what you have are a whole bunch of things that are high quality. Each one of those little nodes is something high quality, but the problem is nobody's sharing them. But on the right, you have all kinds of memes and things that are very low quality, nothing real analysis based at all, but everyone's sharing them. And this is what information scientists are finding out, is that people are sharing more stuff that has lower quality, because we only have so much time. We see something, we agree with it, we reshare it. There it goes, and then somebody else sees it. What we're trying to do is find some kind of way to share more of the high quality stuff on the left that people can understand. We need more science communicators and science translators. So what can you do? What can you actually do? Because like I said earlier, media analysis, media literacies, that kind of thing, it's kind of a Band-Aid. It does help, but there are ways that you can start to, train yourself. And these are things that we borrow from the scientific method, right? To slow down, to observe, to be aware of what your brain is doing, to think about before you hit that like button or that share button, or you talk to somebody about something, right? So why do you trust this? There's also this concept that's known as Brandolini's law. And this is something I think is very important to remember. He says that the amount of information needed to refute lies is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. Now, I did change one word in there. He did not say the word lies. He used a word that starts with B and ends with T to get people's attention, but I thought I would use this word instead. This harkens back to something Mark Twain said a long time ago, where he said a lie can make it halfway around the world while the truth is still getting its shoes on. Mark Twain lived way before computers and social media, so he knew how humans worked, and now we're seeing that in action. What does this mean for us? This means that because you are part of information networks, you have to stand up more often. You can't let bad ideas or misinformation wander into the vacuum and just have their day. You have to basically speak up for things when you know something is not true and say, nope, that's not right. I know because this scientist said this, right? We can't just let people say whatever they want all the time. Now, that doesn't mean you should spend the rest of your days just online fighting with people. No, but you have to basically keep good ideas alive. Remember what I said earlier, knowledge is sustained by communities and groups. You are part of those communities and those groups. And then you can also do things like basic understanding of logical fallacies. My students love doing this, where we recognize and name different logical fallacies. You can go online and look at the logical fallacy referee to help you understand what it is. Because when we do this, we can be teachers to others, and we can recognize these things in arguments much more quickly and say, nope, that doesn't work. That's an ad hominem. Nope, that's a moving the goalposts, right? And people are like, what's that mean? You're like, let me tell you, let me teach you. And then there's all the cognitive biases. So one of the ones, we don't have time today, but look it up when you get home, the Dunning-Kruger effect. We know that this has been around for humans for a long time, but we're seeing it more and more with our technology now. Basically, what the Dunning-Kruger effect says is that when people have very little information about a topic, they are wildly overconfident in that information. So you can ask somebody like, how do you feel about the situation at the US southern border? And they're like, well, let me tell you, I got all kinds of opinions. And you're like, okay, so how does that work? And they're like, oh, right? They can tell you how they feel about it, but they can't explain what it is, right? That's a problem. That's a problem. Here's another good thing you can do. Use the SIFT method. This is from an information scientist named Mike Caulfield. Mike's he lives and breathes this stuff, and you can find all of his work online. Stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, trace claims. And you think, well, that's a lot of work, right? Well, it is at first, but once you get in the habit of doing it, it becomes way easier. I have friends who know what I do for a living, and so I often get texts and they're like, hey, is this true? And then I spend like a minute finding it. I'm like, nope, it's wrong. It's not true. Here you go. And they're like, how'd you find it? I'm like, this is what I do. So you too can be a sifter. You can do this kind of work if you train yourself with how to do it. So how else can we do this? We need to think about not just our bodies, but also our brains, right? So you have to think about conversations as being like laboratories, testing ideas, testing arguments, reflecting on what you read and hear. These are all very important things. And if we don't fix this, it's not the future that we should be worried about. It's also the past, right? To quote George Orwell, whoever controls the past controls the present. Whoever controls the present controls the future. And so now fake information, misinformation is coming for video, for archived text, and creating things that never existed before. And in study after study after study, neuroscientists and psychologists will tell you that people fall for it every single time. They think that President Obama said this when he never actually said it. So it's not just coming for the future, it's also coming for the past. So that's what's at stake. So what can you do? Lots of books are out there. I can recommend even more than these, but these are just a handful of the ones that I have students work with and read in my classes. Carl Sagan, The Demon Haunted World is an excellent book, even though it was written over 30 years ago. And then there's tons of experts that you can find, especially on the social media site Twitter. We often think that Twitter is like a cesspool that's dangerous, that you shouldn't go there. There are lots of extremely smart people at communicating their amazing work on Twitter, including folks like Kate Starbird, Mike Caulfield, Zeynep Tufekci, Renee DeResta. They do this kind of work. They're the ones helping people understand how their brains work. So wrapping up, because I know I'm going over a little bit and I apologize for that, but we should have hope despite all of this. We're not going to be able to solve these problems with old solutions. We need new ones. Media literacy is part of that, but so is science. So to attack these problems, we got to get to the root. We have to work with other disciplines. We have to ask sociologists and psychologists how this works. We have to ask historians why people have been angry about X for so long, right? These things can't be solved by journalists alone. They have to be solved by an interdisciplinary army of people who care. And it's also about reclaiming our focus and our attention, to be aware of your own filters, your own biases, right? Know how information is created, how it gets shared, because you're sharing it too, right? Every one of you has some way of sharing information. And at the end of the day, this is crucial, because one of those shared realities, one of those social realities that we have, is our own democracy. We agree on all kinds of things that make democracy work. If we start to disagree about what those things are, our communities start to fracture. We can't have that. We have to learn how to live with one another. And part of that is being an engaged citizen, understanding information's role in a democracy, be a teacher to others, be a sharer, right? And if we don't do that, then we're going to have a fractured country. So I hope that at the end of the day, you can be a better teacher and a better sharer, because at the end of the day, you have that power right in your pocket. Thank you.
Yes. It seems to me there's a generational thing going on, because the kind of stuff you're talking about doesn't exist for me, because I'm the older generation.
Sure.
And I read newspapers. I probably get more of my information from newspapers, and I have to admit public radio.
Yep.
So I don't know. That's all. I just want to say I think that there's a generational thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a generational divide. I think that there are always exceptions to that. You know, I see folks who go to, like, for example, just last night, I saw something on Twitter where a gentleman at a Senator Chuck Grassley's forum asked a question of Senator Grassley about what was going on in Ukraine. And every single thing he said was not true. It was basically information that had been disseminated by RT, Russia television, and he saw somewhere on social media. And Senator Grassley was just sort of like, well, I don't know how to answer that. You know, he was kind of confused because it was stuff about Nazis and, you know, just not true stuff. And so, but this gentleman was probably 60, 65, maybe 70 years old. So older generation. So I think there is a generational divide, but I think that there's still plenty of people who are getting this information from those kinds of sources.
I have to agree with that. I know people my age and older who say the most outrageous things
Sure.
that they think are true.
And don't get me wrong either. It's not limited to that age group. Like, people of all ages fall prey to this stuff. I have students who ask me questions about things and I'm like, where did you, they're like, one student asked me, did Helen Keller exist?
Yeah.
I said, where'd you hear that? And they said, well, there are these TikToks that say that she wasn't real. And they were serious. Like, they wanted to know. This is an 18-year-old student, right? So the stuff they see, it's like, that's what they trust because it's part of their community, right? So there is a generational aspect to it. Yeah.
I have to think that here maybe and other places too, that the medium is the message.
It is. Marshall McLuhan got it right. And he wrote, you know, this is a Canadian media specialist who lived before the era of the web and smart technology. And he wrote, the medium is the message, which basically said, you know, it's not what you're necessarily seeing on your TV. It's the way the TV works that changes the way you think about it. We're seeing that McLuhan's work has been like reborn with all of this. So, yeah.
Dan, I have a question. On one of your earlier slides, when you were talking about social reality,
Yeah.
At the bottom of the slide, you had empathy listed in there.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't specifically address that, but the things that you said at the end of your talk
Yes.
about sharing and
Yes.
and educating
Mhm.
and being
A sharer. Yeah.
well, being a citizen.
Yes.
You know,
Yep.
all kind of tie in with that. And we've heard that in our previous talks before. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I did put that in there about empathy and I neglected to mention it. Empathy is such an important part of being a human being, especially being part of a community. One of the things that science teaches us about empathy is that obviously it's possible and that we can do it. But the problem is that, like a lot of this other stuff that I mentioned, we have to work at it. Empathy requires a lot of cognitive load. So basically it means you have to think about what you're doing. And most of the time, the brain doesn't want to do that, right? The brain's default state is to sort of just, you know, rest and do the things that it evolved to do. It did not necessarily evolve to be empathetic all the time. It evolved to survive. So if we're going to be empathetic, if we're going to employ empathy more in our communities, which we need to, because that helps us to put ourselves into other people's shoes and see things through different perspectives, we have to actually mentally work at that. We can't just assume the brain is going to do it on its own. So that's the problem with some of this, is that I'm basically giving you a lot of homework. So you have to do more mentally, and empathy requires that. It basically requires a lot more energy. Yeah.
I think another reason people have difficulty getting outside their comfort zone and looking at their biases, et cetera, and maybe looking at the actual facts is because they're afraid of getting upset,
Yes.
having their feelings hurt,
Yep.
and being empathetic will wear them out or wear them down. But I think the thing that people forget is that over the long term, there are rewards to that.
Yes, there are.
Rewards to caring about things. and to
Absolutely.
caring for people, but it's like you gotta go over the mountain before you can get to the other side.
Yeah, you nailed it. And part of this is part of our biology as well. Like we're in a very rare group of organisms on this planet that are social, right? No matter if you're introverted or extroverted, in some way, shape, or form, you're a social being. You're a human being. You're a Homo sapien. And you're right. If you're going to be empathetic, then that often means you have to tell yourself you were wrong about something, or even worse, you have to appear wrong to others. Oh my goodness, humans hate appearing wrong to other people, right? Because the theory is at some point in our evolution, if we were not considered, a strategic part of the group, right? Somebody that was helpful or useful. If we're the person who's always wrong, let's kick that guy out of here, right? Yeah, he's not helping the cause. We're trying to survive over here, right? So admitting that you're wrong to other people, to show that you are, to use a baseball analogy, you have a low batting average, you're gonna have to sit on the bench for a while. Well, that may be true, but at the same time, science does this all the time. Science is all about experimentation, getting things wrong. We should be more comfortable with our ideas in a sort of scientific way. It should be okay to discard an idea because it does not work. But we hold on to our ideas because they make us feel safe and comfortable, and they keep us in that social group. So we have to unlearn that habit, because otherwise, we have to be comfortable with looking incorrect. It's okay to be wrong.
Tied in with that statement, there's another one on the screen that we first react emotionally and then we look for reasons to support it.
Yes.
And, well, and what we've just discussed about, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable to look at the other sides and to be wrong, maybe.
Yep.
But to truly listen. And if we listen and change, it also, I think, diffuses the situation a little bit. So the other person may be able to hear what we're saying so that we can communicate.
Absolutely. And to give you an example of that, one of those biases I talked about, the illusion of explanatory depth, what they've found in some of the initial studies with that is that it does, if you get people to learn more about the position that they hold, and they're given contradictory facts and basically taught the operations of it, right? So it's not just like opinion A, it's like, here's how opinion A works. People feel less severe about it. So you might say, on a scale of 0 to 10, I'm a 10 on closing the border, right? But then when you ask somebody like, how do you close the border? What are all the operations? And they don't know, and then you teach them about it. In the follow-up post-test, the study, they're like a 5 or a 4. They feel less angry about it because now they understand how it works. They may not change their mind, but they're less emotional or angry or upset about it. Yeah. So there is a way, there is a biological and scientific way to basically pull people back from that emotional state. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some sources provide, as you read the text, there's a blue, some part of it's blue or green.
Yep.
I have appreciated that because you click that
Yeah.
and you go to the original source.
Yep.
And then you realize that that's not the original source. That's a comment on a comment of a comment. You go back, pretty soon you find the original source and say, that's sort of nice.
Yeah.
But,
It takes some work, doesn't it?
In this AP report, isn't the direction this thing down here was.
Right. And that's part of SIFT, right?
That's right.
Exactly. And you're describing hyperlinks.
And it's fun. It's fun to go back there because the farther you go, both the more you know And then on the other side, you find out that somebody's shaven the truth.
Precisely. You're investigating, right? That's what SIFT is trying to do. And so what we're trying to do with this is one of the things that a lot of these information specialists advocate with things like SIFT is to what's called read laterally. A lot of people, when they're online, they only look at the tab they have open or the site that they have open, right? And these information specialists say, open all the tabs, open as many tabs as you can to learn about what's going on. You see a hyperlink, open a new tab. You need to find out what this term means, look it up in an encyclopedia, right? Tabs are free. So when you're investigating, you have to read laterally, which means basically go out and see what else exists about it. Don't just trust the thing that you're looking at right on the screen.
But that's also exhausting and.
It is.
time-consuming.
It is.
We describe it as going down the rabbit hole.
It is going down the rabbit hole.
And,
Yeah.
It is.
and it's really hard when you care about a lot of things to pick.
Yep.
It's like picking your battles, which one,
Precisely.
yeah.
And that's why, for certain things, I advocate to my students, if there are issues that you have core beliefs around, like I teach a lot of science students. So for example, I have a student who's really into helping save the environment and try to fix climate change and help make Iowa's water cleaner.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I tell her, you need to have an elevator speech. So when people say something like, oh, the water's okay, she can be like, let me tell you about the water. We've got A, B, C. And they're like, that's right. Right. Now you're not trying to start an argument. You're not trying to jump down their throat, but what you're showing is facts mixed with just the right amount of emotion to show someone, I know about this. If you want to talk about it, I can tell you more with conviction, right? That's good because then people are like, oh, this person knows something. I could maybe learn something from them, right? So there are core things that's worth doing, that exhausting thing. You don't need to do it for every single thing. There's a comic I show my students where it shows a man and he's up late at night on the computer and the woman's like, are you coming to bed? He's like, hold on, someone on the internet is wrong. That's going to be you all the time. Yeah. So pick your battles. Yeah.
But you also have to live with relatives, you're few of them.
You mentioned this before the talk. Yes. Yeah. And that can be,
Trying to listen.
that can be extremely difficult. Yeah. And that's a whole nother talk of how to have conversations with people who are in another, like a very different reality. Because those, like I have books on that. I almost brought one with me today of how to talk to a climate change denier, right? It's a whole book on how do you do that? Because you can't just be like, here are some statistics. I hope you like it. That's not going to work. That's not how these things operate, right? So, and again, you're not trying to tell somebody like you're wrong, right? People, they do not do well with that. You're trying to have a conversation, present what you know, ask questions of them, right? That's one of the most key things of all of this is if someone believes something, ask them a question about it, right? See what kind of answer they have, right? Keep asking them questions. Don't let them just throw out statements.
My daughter has worked at the information desk at the public library for many years, and I found a sign that I bought for her, and it says, and maybe you can repeat this for the people on Zoom.
Sure.
It says, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you.
I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, because it is kind of like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? So what's that? What was that?
Say it again.
Say it again.
Put salt in their oats.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, we figured that one out. All right. Yeah. We'll just put some salt in their oats. Yeah.
How does that?
But what we're trying to do with, a lot of these things I'm showing you this morning is basically, these are ways to try and help people drink from a different stream, right?
Yeah.
To basically see that there is variety and that it's okay to be wrong and that it's okay to change your mind, like when I was talking about politics, we've always had this term flip-flopper, oh, it's bad to be a flip-flopper. Why is it bad to change your mind, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, right? If you believe the same thing, at 90 that you believed at 20, it's like, what have you been doing for 70 years? Like things have changed. You need to look at new data, new information, new knowledge has been created, right? So it's time to reassess, to test your ideas. I often use baseball analogies in my class and I tell students, I'm like, basically trying to recognize an idea or use an idea is like a pitcher and a batter. You can't just go up there, swing and hit a home run. You have to know how the pitcher moves. You have to recognize his pitches. You have to understand what he's trying to do to get you out. And you have to understand what he is expecting of you as the batter, right? You're adapting, right? If we don't adapt mentally, then we're gonna be basically just swinging a broken bat all the time. You have to adapt to the situation.
Anybody else with questions in the audience? Gosh, Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all for coming. This ends our Shear Symposium for this year, but look for next year's Shear Symposium. We're going to continue this next year.
And we haven't picked the topic yet, right? So
Well, we've got a few ideas going on, and I do want to
have
thank.
suggestions.
Well, absolutely. Sally Wilson and I are both retiring, but at least I'm going to still be here. And Nancy Adams is stepping in Sally's role as my co-coordinator, and I'm going to miss Sally and her creativity.
Hey, thank you.
And
Thank
thank
you
you
for
both for inviting me. I appreciate it. So, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.